It is good to be able to come talk with you about the ongoing supply chain disruptions and adaptations that are continuing to happen, and as we all continue to learn how to deal with them. So my role in our Center for Transportation and Logistics is to lead the Humanitarian Supply Chain Lab, which means I think about supply chains that meet needs, especially in crisis. A lot of that work initially began with international organizations and continues with them, like the International Red Cross, the UN organizations, NGOs, also development organizations like USAID, trying to strengthen supply chains in challenging environments. And domestically, we work a lot with FEMA and the emergency management community broadly, state and local, and the growing emergency management community within companies. I've seen a lot of companies starting to create specific roles for business continuity and even growing the staff throughout the crisis. And we are trying to encourage more of that, that connection between the government emergency managers and the private sector emergency managers, because if we're going to try to deal with supply chain challenges that are important to meet all of our needs, we have to figure out a way to coordinate a bit better to leverage the capacities that are available when we have a lot of disruption. So I'm going to share some experiences. Needless to say, we've been pretty busy the last couple of years in our work. And I want to share what we've been seeing and what we can imagine going forward on how to think about tackling and being ready for these kinds of events going forward. So pandemic disruptions have been persistent, as we alluded to. But I'm going to take us back to the beginning. We started working with FEMA actually in January 2020. When we saw the first outbreak in China, we knew that could have implications on global supply chains. We were talking with FEMA about how to get ready in case it would cause disruptions to bringing goods into the country, and in case the virus would travel too. And then in March, we got activated. And we actually, in a lot of crises, FEMA, through a contracting mechanism, brings us academics on board to do real-time analysis and understanding what's happening in private sector supply chains so they can better prepare the government support for those supply chains and identify where government could play a specific role. And so early on, one of the big things was the non-pharmaceutical interventions. So it made business planning difficult because different jurisdictions were implementing different types of interventions. And everybody was adjusting to figuring out how to keep people safe. And the other big thing in the disruptions in the supply chain is we had absenteeism both from the disease, but also indirectly from safety concerns, taking care of family, a lot of immediate disruption in the US when the virus came. So one of the first things we helped articulate to FEMA, who sent it on to state and local organizations, is this list of things to be thinking about. We started with the role of essential businesses, and a supply chain has several businesses in the supply chain. So it's not just the final point like the hospital, but understanding all of the parties that are involved upstream and making sure the hospital has supplies. And then expanding that to include the workers for each of those organizations. And it's not just the obvious ones, but it's people like service technicians and drivers and so forth. And then provide the safety for those. Those are the top three. We said, you've got to define this well so that any non-pharmaceutical interventions to prevent the spread of the disease doesn't cripple key parts of global supply chains. And actually on that part, the government was pretty quick. So the Department of Homeland Security, they had already a version 2.0 of defining essential workers. A day after we sent that, they updated it and put it out so that the state and local governments had a definitive federal position on who's essential that they could use. That is important because you want to define essential workers the same across jurisdictions because supply chains span jurisdictions. So a company doesn't want to have to adjust to every state taking a different assumption on this. So it was important to put that out up front in defining who is an essential worker early on in the crisis. The guidance on how to keep them safe was a little slower in coming. This was as of May 10. There was only a few things, and mainly the main one was the meat and poultry, because we had an early outbreak in meat and poultry, so then they quickly put something together. But there wasn't ready guidance on how to keep workers safe in lots of essential businesses. So this has been broadened throughout the pandemic, but early on, we weren't as ready to help companies figure out how to keep their workers safe What's the guidelines I should be using? I'm not used to dealing with personal protective equipment. What should we really be doing? And back then we were thinking surfaces were a big deal. And so how do you provide guidance to help companies keep their operations going safely? One of the other challenges is we did have jurisdictional problems. One of the good examples is at one point New York City put an appropriate policy in place that if you come into this city, that you have to stay in quarantine for 2 weeks before you can. It was early on in trying to identify how to keep people safe from spreading the disease, but truck drivers come in and out of that market regularly. And so there was some correction right away when we said, hey, you've got to make sure that those truck drivers don't get quarantined for 2 weeks because they got to keep running their loads. Which also highlights, this is an illustration I use with the federal government to say, you see the boundaries here of states, that's how you implement policies, but these markets here, this is a common way of looking at transportation markets, and you notice that the New York market actually includes Connecticut from a transportation perspective. That's the way things tend to work. So your jurisdictions don't align with private sector market situations. So if there's discontinuity in those, it makes it difficult to operate. Also, understanding the nature of work, we had at one point step in to advise the state of Pennsylvania not to shut down rest stops because truck drivers actually have to stop in order to do their work. So those kinds of things, understanding the nature of how a supply chain works so that the appropriate health interventions are not going to cripple the essential goods we need to get from those supply chains. Then obviously that cascaded into lots of volatility. Early on, we had that surge in demand for essential businesses and then non-essential businesses going away. One thing we were closely monitoring for FEMA was food, because they were trying to help HHS on the health side, and they said, you need to give us early warning if we need to get ready any kind of food support. And they did provide a lot of food support through food banks and so forth, but thankfully the food sector was adapting to food away from home. Restaurants not having any demand to everything coming to food at home and grocery stores. Some of those hiccups were a little challenging, but there was a lot of adaptation to make sure that nutrition and calories were able to flow to people. And I think it was mentioned this morning by the speakers, there's been an amazing amount of adaptation in supply chains to continue meeting basic needs. But the volatility in global supply chains the disruption started cascading effects that then play out dynamically, and the ripple effects, and there's not been any kind of equilibrium or steady state in terms of planning a supply chain since March 2020. And that makes it, and we don't understand, a lot of companies don't fully understand all the vulnerabilities in their supply networks, and it's really difficult when it's so volatile to know how to plan effectively. Thankfully, we do a lot of work with FEMA. We're used to having infrastructure disruptions and communications go down. Thankfully, that did not happen. In fact, driving trucks early on was really easy because there was no traffic. But we also then, we were looking very closely at freight movement as well. There's no way to really know how all supply chains are really adapting and what's working, what's not. But if you see the truckload movements, full truckload movements in the US, you get an idea of how supply chains are flowing or not flowing. One of the interesting things early on, again, mentioning that outbreak in meat processing, this is the hog and pig inventory and where the production of pork is. It's mostly in the upper Midwest and then this real cluster in North Carolina. And when they had the outbreaks there and there was a clamp down and a real surge in trying to adapt to keep workers safe, the production went down. You can see that in the refrigerated volumes. This is the tender volumes. These are the requests for trucks with refrigeration capacity, and it dropped in those areas around North Carolina. It dropped in the upper Midwest. It surged right here because there was a big warehouse with frozen pork, right? So we're not taking it from the factory, we're now taking it from the inventory, and thankfully there was a good stock. It was a good time of the year to have frozen pork in inventory, and so there wasn't a huge disruption in the pork supply because there was inventory capacity that was then obviously the trucks went to the warehouse to source from that. So you can start to see patterns emerge. Even if it's hard to track every supply chain, seeing where trucks are going gives you an idea of what's going on. So we were watching freight throughout the pandemic. And including, this is the whole US. This is tender volumes throughout the US. over a longer period. And you can see typical patterns emerge in terms of requests for trucks. So the big dips here are, what time of year? This is November, that's Christmas, right? Before that, the second biggest drop is Thanksgiving, and we can see the major holidays in the summer, Memorial Day, July 4, Labor Day. So those are typical patterns. We see those on a regular basis. So what happened in March 2020? Did it collapse? Did it surge? March, and this is March, we're just getting the virus coming in. There's a surge. Moving things, we don't know what's going to happen, a lot of uncertainty. Let's get trucks, let's move things, because we don't know what's going to be happening. Then what happened in April? We were shut down, so dropped significantly. Then what happened next? So we're starting to see patterns, right? So what happens next? Goes up? Mostly saying going up? Significantly going up. Why is this? The requests for trucks indicate adaptation. So most companies contract for their truckload shipments. They have specific lanes aligned with the design of their supply chain. And they tend to contract with the big carriers, give us capacity going from Chicago to San Francisco, and they plan ahead around their supply chain structure. What happened in COVID is it disrupted. All of those designs kind of went out the window. People were sourcing from different locations, shipping to different locations, and that churn and that friction of adapting how you source and move is reflected in just calling up, because we don't have contracts going from this new location that we're using. So we have to go out and make a lot more requests. And this has continued. This has not really dropped off. It's been a high level of activity of trying to find truckload capacity as supply chains continue to adapt throughout the whole crisis. So this is a good indicator of ongoing friction. When this drops down, when we see these levels again, then we can start saying the pandemic's over in terms of supply chain disruption, but it's not there yet. The one that you probably all are aware of is the ports in Los Angeles, because everybody's trying to buy Christmas gifts. I was really popular last fall asking about how to find things for Christmas. And you saw it peaked in November, and it has dropped off. This is just the San Pedro Bay, Los Angeles, Long Beach, the dwell time of longer than 5 days. And so you see it dropping off a little bit now. Things have started to stabilize with the flow coming in, but notice it's still much higher than it was in April and that it is historically. So it's still at a high level of backlog. It's just we're not trying to buy Christmas gifts and not panicking about it at the moment. And that's really a relation to, there's disruptions in the supply chain, but there's also an incredible amount of demand. So this is you see that this is for durable goods, pretty steady growth up till 2020, then it dropped off with the shutdown, and then it just surged at a significant rate. This is the same for non-durable goods too. So we've seen bottlenecks at ports, partly because of disruptions and adaptation, but a lot because American consumers are pulling a lot through those ports. They're designed to really, they're optimized around certain flows that typically grow in a predictable way. And they're adding capacity incrementally. They weren't set up to adapt and surge. And it's not just the ports, it's also the whole system of moving containers into warehouses. So this supply chain disruption has persisted. Lots of COVID waves have made this a problem. Compounding events, hurricanes, the Texas freeze is another a disruptive event that really had compounding effects in many ways. We do a lot of work with bottled water manufacturers for disaster response, and they're still struggling. They struggled a lot last year with getting PET supply to make bottles, because they usually do a build in the spring for summer consumption, and they just couldn't get supply because of a short petrochemical shutdown due to the Texas freeze had a major ripple effect on bottled water manufacturing. And they weren't able to build their inventories they typically are used to. I'll talk about Colonial Pipeline in a moment here. But then the underlying demand pressure has kept these supply chains strained. But as a result, it reveals bottlenecks. It helps us start studying how these systems work. And And it has also caused a lot of actors who typically, a lot of times may take a hold your breath approach to a disruption. They're looking at, well, maybe there's potential for chronic disequilibrium and things not being steady state. The pandemic has extended for a long period of time, but there's other things. This morning we talked about labor and shifts in labor and how is that going to cause disequilibrium in our supply chains. Environmental, the extreme weather we just mentioned, and then political, trade regulations, and then obviously conflict stresses supply chains. So how do we think about optimizing supply chains, but also planning to be able to adapt them when conditions are not stable to eke out optimization gains? So that increased focus on supply chain resilience kind of shows up in Google Trends. I just thought I'd see a little interest in supply chain. Sure enough, last year before Christmas was the historic high in terms of people searching for supply chain. Resilience has been a growing trend over time. I didn't put it on here, but sustainability kind of spiked right here and has been kind of flat. There's been an increasing interest in resilience as a concept. But when you put them together, supply chain resilience, it was basically flat until 2020. So this is a new area that people are trying to understand more and figure out how do we complement our typical optimization of supply chains with the adaptation required to be resilient. And some of this is the government doing searches. So in the last few weeks, the government released their one-year studies. There are 7 agencies that put out studies about supply chain resilience. The 2 big things that have come out so far is that the Office of Management Budget will issue a new Buy American rule to new product categories so that there could be price preferences. And then the Defense Production Act, which can offer incentives. In this case, they're trying to help build out and expand certain capacities in the supply chain are being deployed. But we also know that the DPA can be used as a stick to force manufacturers to comply and build things and also force you to share data. What we're trying to do as academics is help create the private sector-led initiatives that how can the government be a resource to help us all figure out the problems so we don't have to rely on sticks to have them come in and try to control it. We started doing this, we've been working with government for a while, starting back in 2017 with the hurricane season. We had we got mostly, our center has a lot of private sector companies. We got them together and a few government officials to say, how did supply chains have to adapt to that hurricane season? And a lot of these insights applied very much the same way during the pandemic. The fragility of optimized networks, the coupling of human and technological systems, and then the cascading effects and understanding those. That prompted FEMA to then, well, and also this is another thing that we, in getting things into Puerto Rico during the Hurricane Maria, we started making this connection. You have to look at, for moving goods in, tractors, trailers, containers, and chassis. We saw chassis, that was the biggest issue in Puerto Rico. And that's another thing we saw in terms of the ability to surge the port imports to meet demand. FEMA then sponsored a study by the national academies to look at this topic of supply chain resilience. They came up with 4 recommendations. The first one's basically helping FEMA see its role in helping to restore regular supply chains, the private sector, because that's where all the capacity is. But the next 3 are really about what you need to do to have resilience is build a system-level understanding of how supply chains can dynamically play out so you can have effective decision support in a dynamic situation, supporting coordination, and then developing training to help people understand this. So I'm going to share a couple of experiences recently on system understanding. One of them is work with Massachusetts, sponsored by HHS, working with Massachusetts General Hospital on personal protective equipment during the crisis. And another one is on fuel, sparked by the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack. So, and there's some public summaries available online if you want to look at those. This isn't my first pandemic. I was involved in the Ebola pandemic, supporting academic partners from UMass and Harvard, and they were affiliated with Boston Children's Hospital, to support the Liberian hospitals based on the request from the government these hospitals had been doing training of doctors in Liberia, so they asked us to help provide PPE. We got some money from the Paul Allen Foundation. And for one of the rare times as an academic, I was actually asked to run a supply chain. So I had to procure the PPE at a time when UNICEF had just had a meeting allocating all of the available known capacity for this specific coverall that was important for bloodborne pathogens. So I had my work cut out for me, and I was dealing with standards of care that were draft. So I tried to find the appropriate standards, and I tried to source something. And again, everyone was buying this particular kind, and all the capacity was taken up. But through working through a different type of distributor, they were able to access an industrial supplier that didn't typically work in the health sector. But they made a coverall that met all of the bloodborne pathogen requirements. But they weren't currently servicing any organizations supporting the Ebola crisis at the moment. And so we were able to identify what I called adjacent capacity. They were serving bloodborne pathogens for crime scene investigation, other purposes, but not specifically healthcare. But it met all the standards. It looked a little different, and we had to work through the fact that the hospital workers would trust it because they're used to seeing this look. But we were able to find capacity that wasn't normally used for the health purposes and mobilize it to meet the surge in need for PPE. This happened with masks during the pandemic. My colleague, the head of our center, Yossi Sefi, wrote a book really quickly in the middle of the crisis about a lot of adaptation. There's a lot of good stories in here about what's happened during the pandemic. But different kinds of companies, adapting to make protective masks. So that ability to adapt manufacturing to make a different product has a lot of potential, and we need to be able to find those other manufacturers. Adding manufacturing during COVID, that did happen. This was actually an article just recently in the New York Times that highlighted this, that 36 known companies started making masks, but as soon as the surge in demand passed, the Chinese companies cut their costs and the customers disappeared, and now they're struggling. And the ability for the federal government to provide the price support and buy America is maybe not significant enough. It's only 3% of the economy. So will we be able to add capacity? Not sure if that's going to be a solution, but adapting to different capacity, definitely worthwhile. So that adaptation to adjacent capacity, something we need to be aware of. What kinds of products could be made in different kinds of facilities to meet the needs? In support beyond the production capacity, we look at finding inventory buffers. Most hospitals rely on just-in-time. They stock regularly from their distributors. They moved to a just-in-case situation. They started setting up stockpiles. Not at their hospitals. They don't usually have the storage capacity, but at third-party warehouses. But that, I don't know if that's sustainable. From the companies we talked, from the hospitals we worked with, they're not sure if financially they're going to keep that investment in place. But they also realize that just-in-time is only one part of the Toyota production system, as we know in the manufacturing space. So they're looking at having more direct relationships with suppliers, not just a distributor, but going directly to suppliers to do their procurement so they can have a bit more control and a better partnership for these kinds of crises. And then the fallback is if the hospitals can't get it, what does the government have? And states started looking at putting up stockpiles because the federal government didn't have their backs. And so we did a study looking at how a state could look at the stockpile, but also that starts by understanding demand in the first place. And demand management on PPE is related to crisis standards of care, adjusting how much PPE we need. And that work was supported by ASPR, again with Mass General, talked to a lot of experts, and really we started from the demand side, taking epidemiological other models to figure out what is the actual demand for PPE across all health facilities in a state. And that includes long-term care and other types of facilities. That's the base demand. Then what is it that the facilities themselves can supply from their own stock, from their relationships? Then you define the residual demand that is left for the state to have for a stockpile. So understanding that whole process is really key. And there actually was surprisingly not a lot of work in saying, well, how do cases turn into PPE requirements at a broad level? So we created a simulation for this that also then helped us look at what did those crisis standards of care, what do they allow? Some of them are pretty straightforward, going from 1 to 5 uses a week. Without better data, it's obviously at 80%. We tried to get better data to see how compliant people were with that, but that's still in process to do that analysis. Again, changing the number of visits changes things. But the cohorting part was something that was new, that how much by cohorting patients effectively, so you don't have as many healthcare workers serving them, how much potential is there to reduce PPE demand? And it is pretty high in hospitals, but it's significant in assisted living and skilled nursing. Maybe more difficult to do, but thinking about how could we do a cohorting policy in a future crisis is something that's to be ready going forward for demand management. Testing time, it's still a significant 22%, but in Ebola, the test time turnaround was bigger because the persons under investigation a lot of times for Ebola had the same symptoms from malaria, and so that was a much bigger deal to make sure that you could diagnose malaria and Ebola quickly in a crisis. So all of these things to help manage demand, which is one of the best things you can do when you have a spike. Stockpiles, as I mentioned, in hospitals, this is what they typically carried, self-reported. I don't even know if they often carried this much. They reported going up to, there's a magical number in the health space, you keep 90 days of supply. So a lot of them reported that. But the ability to keep that stockpile, again, financially may be a challenge for these companies. And what difference does that make in terms of how a state would plan its stockpile? This is the demand running a simulation of an Ebola, of a COVID-like situation. This would be the same level of COVID. This would be both with pre-COVID stockpiles, what they had ahead of time. So the residual demand covered by the state is significant. Whereas if they keep these stockpiles, these higher stockpiles in place, it gives you much less demand to have to be ready for, but also it gives you more time as a state to mobilize further supply. So it buys you time. If in addition, these hospitals can build better relationships to have more reliable supply, then that also further cuts it down to the point where if they keep their stockpiles and build relationships in a future COVID pandemic, the state wouldn't need to be able to do anything to meet PPE needs. So I don't think we're going to be there, but just understanding what kinds of ranges, and then being able to monitor. The important thing is having the state monitor how prepared hospitals remain going forward so they can adjust their stockpile accordingly. I want to just briefly talk about the Colonial Pipeline as a way of understanding systems in a more detailed way. In this case, we've been building off of work for a while with FEMA to understand during disasters. So for those of you who don't know the Colonial Pipeline, it goes up the East Coast. It really is a key conduit for fuel for the East Coast because the ports can only serve so much demand. So we need this for supply. We looked at 43 different ways to adjust the system to try to help surge in a crisis or deal with a disruption. And we identified 43 that potentially could be used, have been used, created anecdotal evidence for where it existed, and then we tried to do some modeling for some of these to see what the impact would be, cost benefit of the preparedness work. And what we're really focusing on is the downstream part of the supply chain here, of refining the fuel, moving it to a terminal, and then moving it to a point of sale, which is mostly done by pipelines and barges to the terminal, and then it's only done by trucks to the point of sale. And we see a lot of times in hurricanes this kind of a backlog at a terminal, or what they call a fuel rack, to replenish the trucks to go to the fuel stations. And we wondered why that existed, what the problem is. After Hurricane Irma, Florida also wondered this, and they did a study, but their focus was on adding capacity, building more racks at the terminals, establishing state-owned facilities, and being at meetings with the private sector, that was going over like a lead balloon. I'm going to have to add racks that I will only use three days a year at most. It's not a value proposition. It's not sustainable financially for them to do that. We said, what can we do to adapt this system? Looking at the whole process, looking at how a group of terminals are configured, how trucks enter. Can we optimize the flow, somehow do things to make it churn out capacity faster? And I'm going to highlight two quick case studies here, one in Florida. We also did one in Utah related to an earthquake in Utah. And this is at a high level. These are 5 interventions that we saw as being potentially useful, accelerating the gate, adding more check-in, making the flow at the bays faster, helping the trucks move faster with escorts, increasing, providing access for more drivers to have certification to work in the area, and then increasing hours of service, which is an easy thing for the government to do. And hours of service has the biggest impact. And in normal demand, Florida has about 136% surge capacity to meet surges for holidays, et cetera. If we just do hours of service, it goes to 186%, and if we do all 5, 250% roughly. If we didn't have Tampa, which would be a major loss with a hurricane hit that's just, there's still a lot of residual capacity in Florida to meet demand, much less, but if we put these interventions in place, it could surge and meet some of the demand, and generally demand for fuel is higher after a hurricane because you have emergency power with generators requiring fuel too. But it was surprisingly not so bad, in part because you have all these ports where the middle mile can provide supply. Trucks have to drive further, but with some interventions, we might be able to keep up with some of the demand. Utah generally has a lot more capacity to move fuel, but a lot of the refining capacity is in Salt Lake, and if the Wasatch earthquake hits, you'll probably lose most of that, and then you drop off significantly in order to be able to meet fuel demand. So here, it's interventions on the last mile are not enough. We need to think about the middle mile and things like the pipeline that normally pushes fuel out of these refineries to Las Vegas. What if we reverse the flow to bring fuel in? Things like that to know how to prepare for something catastrophic. So this is the way we're trying to analyze systems to understand how they can adapt to surge without having to invest in an inordinate amount of preparedness infrastructure and assets. And we also have nice graphics. The idea is to get people together. We have a lab that allows people to play with models and run scenarios together to get the public and private sector together to problem solve and figure out how would we actually do this if we had a hurricane, and run different scenarios and train on this. We have models that help us think about this. But what I want to close with is this idea of the solutions for adaptation require us to actually have connections and be able to work together. We have to, those levers I mentioned, you have to pull several levers to actually change the flow. In the port operations, you don't just make the port run 24/7 and that magically makes the capacity go up. You have to complement that with other things to make sure the whole system has capacity. And so that requires cooperation. And so beyond moving from a hold your breath to an awareness of supply chain resilience being something you want to think about, how do you do that? Study of complex systems, which is something we're trying to facilitate with the government, and a process to identify weak signals and rapidly validate what's happening in a crisis, and then evidence to pre-stage the things that are effective. Get ready to do things that we might be able to, might need to do in the future, but have a way of, based on the study of the systems, knowing which things are going to be most impactful as interventions. And that's really back to this coordination. Recommendation 3, how would we share information in a crisis, but also how do we learn together ahead of a crisis on what we need to be doing? Some of this monitoring that happened, companies, again in Yossi's book, talked about they were doing a lot more monitoring of their suppliers during the pandemic. Great, but that's your company. How do you know what's happening more broadly? This is, again, something we do with FEMA. We reach out to companies to participate in what we call a rapid peer review process. We compile a draft of what we think is happening, and then we put it together, send it out. Within 24 hours, we get feedback from lots of private sector operators to say, yes, this is right, this isn't right, and then we pull this together as a quickly peer-reviewed assessment for the government to understand what's happening in the private sector. A lot of companies find this useful for their own decision-making as well. So we want to facilitate more of that. As an honest broker in academia, I think we can play that role to help people get information and monitor not only their supply chain, but see other perspectives so that we can all use that broader information. In addition, cooperative problem solving is key during crisis. We did work early on with the UN, what's called the logistics cluster. And this isn't actually during a crisis, this is a training. They do this on a regular basis. They get together and train and practice for what they would do in a crisis. I don't have a lot of companies doing this, but I want to invite this growing cohort of people focused on business continuity to join in these kinds of sessions because the solutions to problems, optimization problems, you have constraints and goals, but there's a lot of dynamic perception that has to come into play. And this concept of solving and formulating back and forth quickly is something that we need to be able to do faster in the private sector as well. So hopefully we can help to convene more of these kinds of sessions where solving challenging problems can support training your people, but also help you prepare better. And then you can build those relationships, which are really essential to adapting in a crisis. And there's plenty of challenging problems out there to look at. I'll highlight for those of you in the Pacific Northwest who have family there, the Cascadian subduction zone is a major fault, bigger than San Andreas. It would be a bigger earthquake. It happens, they've been able to assess about every 5 centuries. Last time we had it, about 5 centuries ago. So this is a very keen thing. And in fact, the government is planning a national exercise in June. Again, this is the public sector training, but they invite the private sector to be part of this. So we can help connect you with this to help you think through this kind of a scenario, because we're going to lose 80% of our ability to move food to people out of it, because all the food warehouses are on soil that's going to liquefy. It's going to be hard to feed everyone. So if you like hard problems and your company sees value in this, we'd like to help bring you into that circle to help us figure out together what we would do in that kind of a crisis. And obviously Ukraine, I've been watching the logistics cluster actually do their planning in real time, dealing with an ongoing crisis there, which is really complex. So lots of things lots of challenges that we need to be thinking about. And we believe that that collective approach is not only helpful for preparedness, but also provides ongoing value to companies because they're thinking about how their supply chains work in a better way. And their employees are more able to adapt to the smaller disruptions that happen all the time. So with that, I have some questions here. Oh, thank you. So what is the source of increased consumer demand? Money normally spent on personal travel being spent on goods, government stimulus. There are a lot of people studying this. I think it's yes to those things. We're studying how supply chains respond to the demand signal. We can see it happening in terms of what's causing it. That's not where we've been focusing our efforts. But anecdotally, we hear a lot of this too, that people having more time at home, investing in their home life as well. So a lot of things that are contributing to that. But it's the key is we see the pattern that the supply chains have had to adapt to. And it's very clear that that's been a very different demand scenario. And I don't know what's going to happen. And again, companies are going to be afraid to invest too much to meet a new slope of increase in spending because they don't think that's sustainable. So this is a common situation in a crisis is where, well, there's a surge, and so do we build to that surge? Most of the time we think it's going to revert to a norm or maybe even drop because spending has happened now and it's going to be deferred in the future. So it's even harder to think about adding capacity. So that adaptation is more important because it's unlikely to stimulate quick investment. So a move toward distributed manufacturing and its ability to reduce supply chain sensitivity. The more diversity you have, the less focal clusters of manufacturing, the more resilient you are. That's an obvious thing. I think one of the interesting things is not only manufacturing, but also distribution. As we moved a lot toward food at home and home delivery, there was already a growth in home delivery, and there's there was a big surge right during the close downs, the shutdowns. But there's an ongoing increase in delivery to home. And so the concept of local distribution, fulfillment centers in neighborhoods, of dark stores to enable the flow of goods for home delivery. This distributed distribution, I think, is also something that's very interesting to look at in terms of resilience. And back to that earthquake in the Pacific Northwest, one of the most promising things is if our warehouses, all on liquefied soil, go out, the Amazon micro-fulfillment centers and the Albertsons store could be flipped quickly to be a fast flow through, limited SKU, just fulfillment center. And so we might have to do something really crazy like that to replace that large. You're not going to rebuild a massive food warehouse quickly. So how can we leverage the increasing distributed distribution capabilities as well? So I think that is a recipe for resilience, and we're really exploring that actively. I have a PhD student looking at this. She used to help set up Amazon's Prime Now network. Now she's looking at how would we use that in a crisis to actually surge the flow of food to people if necessary. One more. Has the stability of the last 30 years led to outsourcing and a decrease in keeping inventory, making us less resilient? I mean, I think there's a pretty clear evidence. We've been optimizing our supply chains over and over again. And a lot of companies have taken on, they love the low inventory of just in time, but they may not have invested in the relationships to be able to enable that to be viable. And I think we see this throughout our supply chains. They've been optimized in a steady state. And the pandemic has not given us a steady state for 2 years. And we realize that optimized networks just really are difficult to adapt. Some of them better than others, and we're realizing where this is possible, where it's not. But the idea of thinking about building in resilience as part of your design to start with, I think is now something that's being considered. You want to optimize it for regular conditions, but you want to know how robust your design is to be able to adapt to important scenarios that could really disrupt your business. So hopefully this increase in interest in resilience, coupled with our work at really looking at the crazy disasters, helps companies make more resilient supply chains going forward. And we'd love to partner with any of you to help provide information in a crisis, to help you do planning, and then also help us help the government do appropriate things to support our collective resilience in a crisis. Thanks.
Jarrod, thank you.